Katherine Hendy is our next speaker. Katherine is a cultural anthropologist specializing in studies of medicine and science and technology. Her doctoral fieldwork and dissertation studied a small tribe of clinical researchers based out of Santa Cruz, California, and their efforts to develop the drug MDMA as a prescription pharmaceutical. We know who they are. Her dissertation draws primarily from participant observation fieldwork with maps and explores the politics of clinical research. And she's going to say a little bit about that in her paper. Katherine Hendy.
All right, good morning. I don't have slides for you today, but hopefully I will be able to talk in a way that's engaging enough that you won't get bored. And of course, we have the most gorgeous view of any room in this building right now. So, good morning. So today I'd like to talk about psychedelic placebos, or rather, what the challenges in finding a placebo that can properly blind a clinical trial with psychedelics can tell us about the challenges in mainstreaming psychedelics as pharmaceuticals. My talk today is based on my own research with researchers, a study of a study, if you will. From 2010 to 2011, I conducted an ethnographic study of a small group of clinical trial researchers working with a highly unusual pharmaceutical substance, MDMA. The research was the basis for my doctoral thesis in anthropology. Now, anthropologists have long been interested in psychoactive substances, though in the past it has been mainly through their incorporations into different ritual practices. However, my study was not of native rituals, but of the practices of contemporary researchers who are trying to not just develop the drug, but to develop the very protocols that will make the therapeutic value of these substances tangible for regulatory agencies. My talk today will focus on one of the methodological sticking points in conducting a double-blind placebo-controlled trial with a psychedelic drug. That is, finding a placebo that can adequately blind the study. As I will discuss today, recent historical scholarship has argued that the decline in clinical research with psychedelics in the 1960s was not only the result of a political backlash against the substances, but was also a result of the institutionalization of the double-blind placebo-controlled trial as the bureaucratic standard for the approval of new pharmaceutical substances. Placebos and placebo effects are often framed by anthropologists and other social scientists through the problem that they pose to the understanding of mind and body. Namely, how can supposedly inert substances produce therapeutic effects? But placebos also have effectiveness as research techniques. Today in my paper, I argue that the struggle to find an effective placebo meant thinking through not just the effects on subjects, but also the very practices and logics of documentation that permeate clinical research. And that ultimately the difficulties in blinding these studies with substances like MDMA may tell us more about the variety of strategies that are needed to negotiate around different kinds of gatekeeping around psychopharmaceuticals. In my talk today, I'd first like to talk a little bit about methodology for my study as an anthropologist studying clinical research, and then, as anthropologists generally like to frame our data as stories, I'll talk about some of the discussions around blinding that I participated in while observing the clinical team. Then I'd like to provide a little bit of historical background on placebos and conclude with some thoughts about what the struggles to blind studies can tell us about what kind of data counts to whom. So anthropology, for those of you that may or may not know, is a diverse discipline that is loosely held together and at times contentiously held together by the question of what it means to be human. Social anthropology, my particular field, attempts to address contemporary human societies. Now, early social anthropologists traveled all over the world to live in small villages and tribes as part of the ethnographic method. The general rule of thumb was that an anthropologist should live for at least a year in a given village or tribe so that they could witness the entire cycle of seasons. Today, social anthropology has widened its scope considerably. No longer simply content to examine villages or tribes, anthropologists now use those same methods, sometimes called deep hanging out, to take on all kinds of modern social forms. As such, anthropologists spend time with computer hackers, neurobiologists, NGOs, or any number of things. For my study, I spent time with clinical researchers. While I didn't follow the cycle of the seasons, I did follow the cycle of the clinical trial. Rather than working at a specific site for the clinical trials, I worked with the researchers who coordinate the studies. Through 18 months of fieldwork, I attended weekly teleconferences, visited study sites, helped to review documents, draft case report forms, monitor studies, and review databases. My goal was to understand the minute practices through which therapeutic efficacy and safety are established for regulatory agencies, to understand exactly how these things become tangible in the context of clinical research. Thus, I followed the seasons of clinical research. I watched as protocols were drafted, submitted to regulatory agencies, amended, studies initiated, monitored, closed out, databases were cleaned and locked. During my time with the clinical team, I came to have an incredible respect for the work that they put into these studies. Clinical trial research is detail-oriented and document-oriented. While there is much focus on the work of the therapists, the work that happens at the study sites would not be possible without the constant production of a paper trail documenting all that is done and not done in these studies. Part of what makes the contemporary moment so significant for psychedelics is not simply that they are once again being used as therapeutic treatments, but that they are being studied in double-blind, placebo-controlled trials, approved by the Food and Drug Administration. Recent historical scholarship by Matthew Oram has argued that research on the therapeutic use of psychedelics came to a halt in the 1960s due in part to changes in the federal regulation of pharmaceutical research. The movement for double-blind, placebo-controlled studies had been building over the course of the 20th century, but it wasn't required by the FDA until the thalidomide crisis, in which birth defects were linked to an anti-nausea drug prescribed to pregnant women. Now, Oram has argued that prior to psychedelics becoming criminalized at the federal level, research slowly declined due to these shifts in the regulation of clinical studies, because the scientific regulatory shifts were at odds with how psychedelic researchers saw the drugs working. Researchers argued that the complex relationship between the pharmaceutical and the psychological aspects of the drug made it difficult to study through a placebo-controlled trial. Thus, the fact that psychedelics stopped being developed as pharmaceuticals had just as much to do with the inability of researchers to shift towards the new techniques for pharmaceutical research that were emerging mid-century, as it had to do with the use of these drugs in the counterculture. As psychedelics reemerge into the 21st century, they are reemerging into a new framework for pharmaceutical research. We want the dose that fools us without working. This concise articulation of the problem emanates from Rick Doblin, the president of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. The clinical team was discussing the problem of finding a placebo that could adequately blind the clinical trials on MDMA. At the time, the team had already finished the first pilot study in which lactose was used as a placebo comparator, and the results had been positive. The majority of subjects enrolled saw improvements in their symptoms. Now, neither the FDA nor the private IRB board that reviewed the study protocol had a problem with the use of lactose as a placebo. And in fact, the inactive placebo had a powerful advantage. It made it much easier to separate out safety effects. The problems arose when MAPS went to publish the results of their study. Reviewers at one journal questioned the objectivity of the research. How, reviewers asked, could the study be considered blind when MDMA had such robust effects compared to lactose? Could the therapists really have been blinded? Wouldn't the subjects themselves have known what their treatment condition was? After this first study, MAPS began experimenting with what at the time was called an active placebo. And I actually really like that term, but it's apparently not totally correct within clinical research. But in subsequent studies, lower doses of MDMA were administered as active placebos in order to try and blind the studies. The goal was to find, as Doblin puts it, the dose that fools without working. A dose that could produce some amount of psychoactivity such that neither the therapist nor the subjects would know if they were getting the full dose or not. My talk today centers on this quote because of how it neatly sets up the paradox around placebos and double blinds in pharmaceutical research broadly, but also in psychedelic research specifically. Ideally, in clinical research, placebos are only the form of treatment. They represent all that can be ascertained from the ritual of taking a pill or being wheeled in and out of an operating room and being put under anesthesia. They control for both the form of the treatment as well as the ebb and flow of symptoms over time. Supposedly, they are everything but the contents of effects emanating from an active treatment. Thus, their effects can be subtracted away at the conclusion of a study to reveal what, if any, biochemical effects might be produced by the investigational product. But at the same time, and this is why I focus on Rick's quote there. Placebos do need to do something. They need to fool the people involved in the study. Embedded in Doblin's statement is a careful calibration of the two mandates of the placebo, to be similar enough to fool, but not so similar enough to become therapeutic. While the clinical trials with MDMA and other psychoactive materials have a specific set of research problems, all placebos, in fact, must do both. They must do enough to fool everyone, but not so much that they themselves become active and therapeutic. If placebos are ideally pure form, then what is unique about the search for the active placebo is that it tests the very boundary between therapeutic form and content. Because when the treatment itself mobilizes subjective effects, as it does with psychedelic therapy, then differentiating between form and content becomes even more tricky. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to come back to the fascinating history of placebos themselves. But for a second, I'd like to invert Doblin's comment from the dose that fools without working to the dose that works when it fools. Because in this equation, placebos do in fact work. They work when the blind for the study holds. In subsequent studies, the researchers used different levels of MDMA as a control, varying from 25 milligrams to 40 milligrams. Of course, using an active dose of MDMA led to the next logical question, framed by Michael Mithofer: how often do we have to be wrong for it to work? For a time, the clinical team incorporated a belief of condition assignment into the data collection. Subjects and therapists were asked at the end of a treatment session what they thought they had received and how certain they were of their response. The goal was to be able to assess the blind. Thus, the placebo blinding problem became a question of documentation, of creating a space on source records and case report forms. And in many ways, it's a fitting kind of response for clinical researchers to the problem of the placebo. If one has a problem, create a document. However, it's worth reflecting here on the longer history of placebos and how they became incorporated into pharmaceutical research. So the word placebo actually comes from the Latin meaning "I shall please," but has over the centuries become associated with a kind of deceitful pleasure. In medieval times, placebo came to be associated with those that were paid to sing the vespers at funerals. These placebo mourners were seen as providing a kind of false flattery, which is perhaps why the term was adopted by physicians to refer to the bread and sugar pills that were commonly given out to please patients for whom either nothing could be done or for whom nothing was really wrong. Historian Anne Harrington has traced 3 different arcs of epistemological questions the placebo came to answer since the 18th century. She roughly titles them the medical humbug, the research confound, and as the medically interesting therapeutic phenomena. Now, in the first arc, Harrington argues placebos were used to suss out false treatments, to expose practices already thought to be fraudulent. However, in the middle of the 20th century, a second meaning emerged: the placebo effect as a universal confound in research design. And this is when it gets incorporated into clinical research. Ironically, Harrington argues, whereas placebos had previously been used to debunk unorthodox treatments, this new phase universalized the placebo effect such that all treatments were subject to it and all studies had to control for it. As Harrington points out, the placebo effect was both real and not. It was a confound that needed to be eliminated from the experiment and thus not the real effect of the drug, but it was also a universal phenomena. Placebos as research techniques have themselves produced a number of controversies since their incorporation into clinical research in the mid-20th century. Harry Marks, who has chronicled the institutionalized of the randomized controlled trial in the U.S., describes several arguments that physicians themselves posed to implementing the procedures of a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. First, they questioned if it was ethical to allow the roll of a dice to determine who is treated with what. Second, as physicians, they felt it was unethical that they didn't know what their patients were being treated with. And finally, the very premise of the study meant withholding a promising treatment from some patients. This latter problem of withholding treatment is an ethical question that remains in clinical research and continues to shape the use of active comparators in clinical studies. Now, in the 1970s, a third sense of the placebo effect emerged, this time not as medical humbug or research confound, but as a robust phenomena in itself that could give way to new treatments. Developments in psychoneuroimmunology and neurobiology started to leave credence to the idea that the brain could affect the body, namely the discovery of endorphins and of links between the nervous system and immune system. As Harrington argues, neurochemistry gave scientific credence to the existing ideas about the power of positive thinking and the potential value of holistic healing. What if treatments didn't have to directly intervene in disease, but only had to unleash the power of the body to heal itself? Now, serious engagements by medical anthropologists with the placebo effect emerged shortly after the placebo effect as legitimate therapeutic phenomena. In particular, medical anthropologists used the placebo effect to argue for an equivalence between the ritual authority granted to traditional healers and those granted to Western biomedical practitioners. Daniel Moorman has framed the placebo effect as what he calls a meaning response, physiological and psychological effects generated by simply the meaning of a treatment. Now, this wave of medical anthropology used the placebo response to articulate a parallel between Western biomedicine and earlier forms of anthropological study, i.e. folk healing. The placebo response was one critique of biomedicine's concept of the individualized body held distinct from the mind. However, I'd like to argue today that these framings ignore the kind of questions that placebos and their effects pose more generally for the creation of pharmaceutical knowledge. They are not particularly helpful, I'd argue, for thinking about the problems of documenting how often one is wrong, or of this negotiation of the space between being fooled and being treated. In the end, the search for the active placebo has been disregarded, as MAP's clinical trial team begins to develop the phase 3 studies. The low-dose placebo, as it was called, had an unexpected side effect. Subjects receiving the low dose experienced an uptick in anxiety during the experimental sessions. The clinical team speculated that the subtherapeutic dose might also produce a different kind of response, acting like a stimulant that triggered feelings of anxiety in subjects with PTSD. Not merely less than MDMA, it produced a different experience of the drug altogether. What's more, the researchers found that in producing more anxiety, the dose had an anti-therapeutic effect. So while it improved the blinding, it actually made the active dose look better than the lactose placebo. Thus, it proved problematic to both the clinical goal to establish how safe the drug might be and to get a clear picture of its therapeutic effects. Thus, the clinical trial team had returned to the very logic that started the lactose as placebo in the first place. It is easier to separate out the questions of safety and efficacy in an inactive placebo. Now, while both subjects and therapists might be able to tell the difference, the data will not as clearly show the difference in safety. This is, of course, critical as safety issues will be incredibly significant in the assessment of MDMA and any other psychedelic medicine. While I've often been asked by those interested in my field site, does MDMA work? The more vital question for the political viability of both psychedelic science and medicine is probably, is it safe? In moving back to the inactive placebo, the researchers are also making changes to address the question of bias by increasing the blinding of the independent raters who administer the outcome measures. In the current proposals, outcome measures will be administered by a randomized pool of raters, a step that is easier to document, and for which a series of standardized operating procedures and documents can come to account. Both of these responses, both the turn to safety and to documentation, make sense within the logic of clinical research. So what are the lessons here for those interested in the clinical fate of psychedelics, both within the social sciences and without? On the one hand, the clinical research problem that of the placebo is solved with documentation, which is an issue that those interested in the politics of documents might take up. On the other hand, it's not clear that the issue of blinding and placebos will entirely disappear for psychedelics, though the resistance may come from scientific and academic circles. It's worth noting here that the issues of blinding and placebo controls become an issue just at the moment of publication. It becomes an issue when MAPS tries to get their data authorized by a scientific community. Demonstrating MDMA's effectiveness and safety will not just be about having data for the FDA. It will also be about establishing these studies as inside of science for different groups of actors. Or, to put it another way, these substances are going to need different forms of approval from different communities. Thank you. I couldn't see the light, so I don't know. Oh, there it is.
Down here.
Oh, nice. I'm too short.
Oh.
me? Can I do it myself? No? Okay. Hello, can you hear me? Okay,
Hi.
Thanks for the talk. Congratulations. My point of view on this question, I would say the difficulty with the placebo is not only in psychedelics, but in psychiatry. So Foucault once remarked that psychiatry was a monologue of the doctors about the patients. So I would like to know your opinion on this and how we need to shift to incorporate patients' opinions and the will to heal, the will to change, and to have a target and to be active in their own healing instead of being passive subjects that receive a drug and the drug should heal them. So this is a completely passive paradigm. And what psychedelic research is showing us is that the results depend a lot on the patient's attitudes, really. So I'd like to know your opinion on these topics.
Oh, well, I don't know. That was a lovely comment, and I think there's something quite interesting about the way you're framing that the placebos actually assume a certain kind of passivity to the subjects that psychedelics themselves challenge. Yeah, so I don't know what I have to add to it. I think that's a lovely kind of intervention and way to frame it. I'm not quite, I think the interesting part is that for psychiatry right now, part of the struggle over placebos is the inverse of what psychedelics are struggling with, right? The issue is that often people respond so well to the placebo, the question is the drug actually doing anything, right? And so there have been attempts in designing clinical trials for antidepressants to actually screen out what they call placebo responders. So the assumption is this drug should really work, but for some reason, it doesn't look like that way in the study because the placebos do such a great job. Why is that? So it's an odd difference between the problems. For MDMA, the problem is the placebo is so ineffective that you can see just how well the drug works, but without blinding. For these antidepressant trials, the problem is that the placebo works so well that you can't actually see how well the drug works, right? So I think what's interesting is to track out those two different kind of logics and to think about what kinds of subjects are at work in them. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for discussing this topic. It's something that's always puzzled me since I first learned there was scientific research going on with psychedelics. And one way that I have come to conceptualize what psychedelics may be doing and how they might be having a therapeutic effect is perhaps one core aspect of what they do is amplify the placebo effect. And I'm wondering, like, what you think of that idea.
So do they, I'm not sure what I think about that idea, just because I'm an anthropologist, so I'm not right, I don't even know. I mean, what's fascinating about the placebo effect for me is the way, I guess you're using the sort of third sense of the placebo effect I was talking about, where it's not fake, it actually is its own kind of robust phenomena. And something I've been talking to some other researchers about that's fascinating is, if the issue with not having a blind for the study is that the subjects, their improvement in CAP scores is due to expectancy effect, right? What's the difference between expectancy effect, right, and the importance of set and setting for psychedelics? And that's a conversation that I've been having with some people who would think is really fascinating, where the drugs in part work because, or can only work well if you have a certain set of expectations for them, right? So right there, the very logic of how the drug works is totally counterintuitive to the idea that it should be blinded, right? But of course, I mean, all kinds of studies they do many controlled trials in which they're using active comparators and not necessarily placebos. For me, part of the political question is when does the placebo become problematic for psychedelic research, right? And part of what I was trying to point out is that for the FDA, it doesn't seem like it's the critical issue, right? Like if you can present a compelling argument over safety and you can show that you've done your utmost to document the in control for bias, it's not an issue. But for the scientific community, this might become, or I kind of am hypothesizing, a site of gatekeeping, of kind of keeping psychedelics out. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for the excellent talk. Another research area that I'm involved with is meditation research. And there is also this problem of how we can do meditation in a blind manner. And I think you can sort of like generalize the problem is blinding for experience-based therapies. I think right now it is well established and well understood that the action of psychedelics, their healing process is not really through the pharmacological action of the drug, rather it is the experience that the patients get. So my question is that would you agree that, you know, it's the problem with blinding psychedelics can be put into this wider category of how we are doing double-blinded studies with experiences. So to say a more mundane example, how can we design a blinded study for taking a walk in the woods, which I'm also sure has some mental health benefits?
Or another way to frame it, one of the conversations that came up while I was doing research is, you know, psychedelic therapy is pharmaceutical, right? It has a pharmacological agent, but it's also a therapeutic technique, right? And so, in order to get these substances legalized, one has to work through the model for pharmaceuticals, right? There's a different standard for authorizing therapeutic techniques. So, CBT or like any of these other kinds of methods that are used to treat. Obviously, you can't do double blind with that, right? You know, so you control for bias in different areas, right? Which is part of what the response of the clinical trial team is, right? So we can't totally blind everyone in the study, but we can make sure we have done our utmost to make sure that the CAP scores are administered in as unbiased a way as possible, right? So yeah, thank you.
In industrial psychology, there's something called the Hawthorne Effect, where the Hawthorne Corporation played music to the workers and productivity went up. After a while, it declined to baseline, so they took the music away and productivity went up. And what then happened was that people took great care to eliminate the Hawthorne Effect rather than learn from the experience and reframe the question that a bit of novelty works wonders, which could have been a finding. And it seems to me that my cat has a bigger meta level in his behavior when he's pushing the rules than some of these very rigorous academic views, which find it difficult to learn. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to have thoughts on. So are cats smarter than academic researchers? Or perhaps. I'm sorry, can you rephrase the question? Or Well, I think what's interesting is it's not that there is necessarily a lack of flexibility. The question is going to be who and where, right? So there are plenty of studies that happen that don't have double blinds, right? They assess surgical techniques with single blinds, right? So they'll do sham surgeries. And obviously you can't blind the surgeon in that case, right? They do studies in which you use active comparators where you just, if someone has stage 4 lung cancer, you can't give them a placebo treatment, right? Or it's, through kind of negotiations over the ethics of human subject research, you have to give a certain standard of care, particularly to people with terminal illnesses. So, so there are ways to negotiate, and there are many precedents for not necessarily only doing the double-blind placebo-controlled trial, right? There's many ways in which different treatments get authorized without that kind of data. And so part of what I think is interesting is just when it becomes a problem and for whom, right? And that's why I was bringing up the language of kind of gatekeeping. My sense is that there's going to continue to be some pushback from certain academic circles because it's kind of an easy response of, these things work so well because obviously it was expectancy effect, right? But my sense is that it's not, so there's kind of that community that'll resist. But then there's also, for the FDA and regulators, that's not the same issue there for them. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, and just that, psychedelics in mainstream are going to have to persuade different kinds of communities using different kinds of data and argumentation, I guess. There you go. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.